Hello and welcome to the webinar on intermediate roundabouts, part 1 and 2. This is a 30-minute webinar. The first 10 minutes or so are going to be focused on what the course is going to be about. And then the last 20 minutes or so are going to be about roundabout design in general and, hit on some of the high points of what you might need to know when planning or designing a roundabout. The Intermediate Roundabouts course, parts 1 and 2, is going to be offered through UVA's Transportation Training Academy, and it's going to be taught October 1 and 2 in Arlington. The instructors for the course are myself, Junior, on the right side there, and Alec Pachowski. My name is Pete Junior. I'm a senior engineer with Kittleson & Associates in our Baltimore office. I have 8 years of experience in roundabout planning, analysis, and design. I've worked on a number of projects for VDOT, Maryland State Highway Administration, PennDOT, and agencies really all across the country. I've also worked on several large research projects related to roundabouts through NCHRP, such as NCHRP Report 772, which looked at evaluating the performance of roundabouts and corridors. So when you've got 3 or more roundabouts in a row, how do you analyze that differently compared to one roundabout by itself or compared to a series of traffic signals? And I've also done a lot of work related to accommodating blind pedestrians at roundabouts, which is going to be an ADA-related requirement in the near future when the Access Board finalizes some rulemaking. Alec has about 8 years of experience as well. He previously worked in Kittleson's Reston office, and now he works in our Washington, D.C. office, and you'll hear from him a little bit later in the webinar. So what are we going to talk about on October 1st, the day 1 of our course down in Arlington? We're going to have an introduction into roundabouts. What are they? What are they not? Just some, where were the first roundabouts, kind of where have they been built in the U.S., what has Virginia done to date. Then we're going to look at some planning considerations. If you're studying an intersection, what may or may not make it a good candidate for a roundabout. We're going to move on to a spreadsheet that I put together for VDOT that kind of helps a user decide if an intersection is a good location for a roundabout. It's a pretty quick thing to use. It's on VDOT's website, but I think a lot of people don't know about it. So hopefully it's something you'll be comfortable using after this course. And it really just kind of comprehensively looks at a lot of things like delay, safety, cost, and helps you decide, is this a good place for a roundabout, or would a traffic signal or stop sign be more appropriate for this location? Then we're going to get into traffic operations a little bit, and this is a design course, so we don't want to talk a whole lot about traffic operations, but there is a pretty strong relationship at roundabouts between some of the choices you make with regard to lane configuration and other design elements, and how that relates to the design itself. So we want to at least give you some understanding of how analysis of roundabouts is done. Then we'll move on really to the design principles, give you the opportunity to check some things like fastest path speeds and truck accommodation. We'll focus in on single lane roundabouts. We'll talk about some details like pedestrian and bicycle design and vertical design and drainage and those types of things. And then day 1 is going to end with a small group exercise. You'll be in groups of 3 or 4 people, and you'll get a chance to actually sit down and draw a roundabout yourself. On paper and pencil. If you don't know how to use CAD, that's okay. We're not going to be using CAD, but this is a chance to really do your own roundabout design. Day 2 is going to start with information on traffic control devices, what kind of signing and pavement marking you use at roundabouts, what's in the MUTCD. But then the focus of day 2 is really going to be on multi-lane roundabouts. That's something we're not able to get to in the one-day class. In the one-day version of our course, there really is an order of magnitude of complexity with multi-lane roundabouts compared to single-lane roundabouts, particularly larger multi-lane roundabouts. And you'll also get a chance to sketch a multi-lane roundabout in a small group. Then we'll move on to some peer reviews where we'll show you some roundabout designs, and you'll get a chance to kind of look at them, perform some checks yourself and think about, are these good roundabouts or should things be done differently? So as I've mentioned a couple times now, this is a 2-day course. It's set up in the UVA TTA system as 2 separate 1-day courses, but the intent really is that you come to both days. If at all possible, you need to do that. Day 2 really builds off day 1, and it's intended that you see both of these days. The goals, this is straight from the advertisement that you probably all read, but what we're really looking for you to be able to do at the end of this course is have a basic understanding of where roundabouts can be used, and really where they shouldn't be used. What are some bad candidates? What are the basic principles? You know, how do you control speeds? How do you create smooth channelization of vehicles? How do you accommodate trucks? Some of those basic things. We want you to understand just some of the state of the art guidance with some other things related to oversized, overweight vehicles, bicycles, and pedestrians. Some of the other kind of more miscellaneous design elements. And lastly, we want you to be able to do some kind of sketch yourself. Really geared towards design staff, or their managers or supervisors, consultants, or even those that primarily supervise consultants but don't, do a lot of hands-on design work themselves. If you've never worked on a roundabout project, don't worry. This course is really designed so that someone with no experience can come and follow along and, not get lost while we're presenting. And now I'm going to turn it over to Alec, and he can talk a little bit about what are some things that you can learn about roundabouts in the remainder of this webinar.
Thanks, Pete. In the next 20 minutes, we're going to go through some introductory material related to roundabouts. While this isn't enough time to go into depth on any topic, we're intending to cover some basic material that will hopefully get you interested in learning more about roundabouts and also provide some useful information as well. We're going to cover 4 topics. First, we're going to start with what makes a roundabout a roundabout. As part of that discussion, we'll touch on some distinguishing features at roundabouts and some features common at other circular intersections, but not at roundabouts. We'll also talk about what to consider when considering roundabouts and why roundabouts are better in some locations and not as good in other locations. This will be followed with a quick overview of how to analyze roundabouts, and will be concluded with a discussion on roundabout design principles. We'll talk about some basic elements to roundabout design and the flexibility available in designing a roundabout. So what is a roundabout? As a circular intersection, roundabouts are part of the traffic circle family. However, I like to think of roundabouts as engineered traffic circles. Unlike other circular intersections you may be familiar with, roundabouts are always yield controlled and have features to slow down entering vehicles. The next few slides will talk about some of these distinguishing features and also discuss why other circular intersections like rotaries and neighborhood traffic circles are not roundabouts. The first distinguishing feature at a roundabout is that it's a circular intersection. However, while most roundabouts are true circles, roundabouts do not have to be a true circle. This slide shows 2 examples of this. On the top left, you see a dumbbell-shaped roundabout in Carmel, Indiana. And on the bottom right, you see the ovular Towson Circle intersection in Towson, Maryland. This intersection actually has the distinction of being Maryland's first multi-lane roundabout. Second, and perhaps most important to roundabouts, is that all roundabouts will be yield on entry. Also called offside priority, yield on entry allows circulating vehicles to exit, which prevents the circulatory roadway from becoming blocked. In reality, this is a fairly simple concept for drivers. As a driver approaches a roundabout, they only have to look one direction for conflicting vehicles. If there is a conflicting vehicle, don't enter. If there is not a conflicting vehicle, enter. Lastly, all roundabouts have geometric features to control speeds. This speed control is created through a concept called deflection. Geometric features like the central island, the splitter islands, and the entry curvature help to develop deflection at roundabouts. As we'll discuss later, the speed control principle is perhaps the most important design characteristic of a roundabout. To sum up the distinguishing features, You have counterclockwise circulation, yield on entry, and geometric and physical features that force flow speeds. I should also point out that roundabouts can have a variety of lane configurations. You can have single-lane entries and exits on some approaches, and multi-lane entries and exits on other approaches. Also, similar to other intersections, drivers should not have to change lanes as they navigate through a roundabout. The proper way to sign and stripe a roundabout will be covered in more detail in our 2-day class. Now that you know what a roundabout is, let's talk about what a roundabout is not. Shown here are 3 examples of circular intersections that are not roundabouts. On the left is DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. DuPont Circle is a large signalized traffic circle in the district that is much larger than most roundabouts. The circle has many entering lanes, pedestrian access to the central island, and medians in the circulatory roadway to separate traffic flow. About the only similarity between DuPont Circle and a roundabout is the circular shape and counterclockwise circulation. On the top right is a picture of a neighborhood traffic calming circle. While this is similar to a roundabout because it's intended to slow speeds, it's not a roundabout. On the bottom right is a rotary. This rotary is also larger than most roundabouts and doesn't have the speed control we'd like to see at roundabouts. This picture of a rotary being converted to a roundabout in Kingston, New York, helps us show the size difference between roundabouts and rotaries. As you can see, the rotary, which is the much larger circle outside of the roundabout, is significantly larger than the roundabout in the middle. In fact, at 250 feet, the inscribed circle diameter, also called the ICD, of the roundabout makes it a fairly large roundabout, where in this case, the roundabout actually pales in comparison to the size of the rotary that it is replacing. This slide shows 3 other circular intersections with features you won't see at a roundabout. On the top left is a signal-controlled approach. On the top right is a traffic circle where the circulating vehicles yield to the entering vehicles. And on the bottom is a stop-controlled approach at a traffic circle. Several other features distinguish roundabouts. At roundabouts, you'll never see pedestrian access to the central island, as shown in the circle to the top left. You also won't have parking in the circulatory roadway, just like the picture shown on the middle right. And, as we discussed earlier, the direction of circulation is always counterclockwise around the central island at a roundabout. At some neighborhood traffic circles, vehicles, especially large vehicles, are allowed to turn in front of the central island, which is never allowed at a roundabout. Now that you understand what roundabouts are, I'm going to turn it over to Pete, who's going to talk about where roundabouts should be built.
Thanks, Alec. I'm going to talk now about where we should build roundabouts and also where we should not build roundabouts. And really, this all boils down to context. Think of roundabouts as one tool in a traffic engineer's toolbox. You're familiar with signals, you're familiar with stop signs. Roundabouts are one more thing we can add to that mix. And there are places where they work very well, and there are places where they don't really make as much sense to build. And, you may want to exercise some caution before proposing one there. Some of the considerations, as with any kind of traffic engineering concept development exercise, what are the traffic volumes, what kind of crashes are occurring, what is around that area, and cost, of course, is a factor. Safety is probably the top reason to consider a roundabout. There are certain types of conflicts. Over on the right there are kind of classic 16-point, or rather 32-point conflict diagram. And if we look at a roundabout on the left here, we've only got 8 conflict points, and we have no crossing conflict points. The T-bones, the right angle collisions, those crash types that tend to be very severe are completely eliminated with a roundabout. If you do have crashes at a roundabout, they're going to be pretty low speed, and they're going to be at angles that are less likely to result in a serious injury. Backing that up with some data, these are before and after studies from the field where a stop sign or a signal existed and it was replaced by a roundabout, and somebody did a long-term, multi-year crash study, and we can really look down at some of the rows here. If we replace a two-way stop with a roundabout, whether it's urban, suburban, rural, there are various changes in total crashes, anywhere from the 72% reduction with the roundabout to a 29% reduction. But if we look over on the right side here and we look at the change in severe injury crashes, we've basically eliminated 80% of them at any type of two-way stop if we put in a roundabout. So it's there aren't many treatments out there that give you that kind of reduction in severe crashes. So a roundabout is pretty powerful in that regard. With signals, we also have, again, there's fewer data there. It's not too often that you tear out a signal and replace it with a roundabout. But with signals, we also see some pretty significant reductions in crashes, on the order of 2/3 to 3/4 of your injury crashes going away. Always stop doesn't give you that much of a safety benefit. Always stops are pretty safe to begin with. But we also know always stops are the least efficient form of intersection. So it is pretty common for a roundabout to replace an always stop, just because the always stop is congested. Moving on then to delay, and here we've got here we have a comparison of a signal and a roundabout, and the red and the blue lines up at the top are average delay at a signalized intersection, and the green and the yellow lines down at the bottom are average delays at a roundabout. And you're probably wondering, what kind of volumes are used here. You can see the major street volume across the bottom. The minor street volume was set right at the MUTCD signal warrant threshold. So this is showing a low volume intersection. Maybe it's a stop sign today. An agency is looking to upgrade it, and they're thinking about roundabout versus signal. In those low volume conditions, a roundabout is going to perform way, way better delay-wise. Obviously, as volumes get high enough, any type of intersection can fail. And this kind of gets into thinking about your entire day versus just your peak hours, where a lot of times signals are needed for peak hour control. That's where your congestion is occurring, and there's a lot of time the rest of the day where you end up with traffic sitting at a red light. There's no one else there. It's pretty inefficient, and a roundabout completely eliminates that issue. So a lot of times we work on projects where we look at an AM and a PM peak hour, and delay's about the same. Then we'll look at a midday or some kind of off-peak period, and a roundabout is way less delay. And, someone at some point decided to make a bumper sticker themed on that. I'd rather be driving through a roundabout than stuck at this stupid red light. What about public attitude is, in my mind, one of the biggest reasons, if not the biggest reasons, that roundabouts aren't built. One of the biggest barriers to implementing roundabouts is kind of public attitude, and also to some extent attitude within agencies. If you design signals and you've designed 100 signals in your career, and now you're faced with a choice between a signal and a roundabout, it's going to be easier for you as a designer to just design signal 101 versus roundabout number 1. So I don't want to entirely overlook that part of it, but public involvement is also a pretty critical element towards successfully implementing roundabouts. And there have been a few studies, they're pretty old, but there have been a few studies done in communities that were going to have their first roundabout, and they went out and asked people beforehand, what do you think of this roundabout? And those are the dark green bars, and you can see negative and very negative, are where the majority of responses are. Some are positive. Really, no one was very positive. We look after, we can't even see very negative and negative. The bars are so low they don't even show up. And this is, this almost is not believable, but this has been shown in, probably 3 or 4 different studies in 3 or 4 different states or cities at different times, that there really is a pretty substantial shift in public involvement public opinion, once a roundabout is built and people can drive through it, all the ideas of it won't work here, our drivers are different, tends to go away. Other considerations for building roundabouts, this happens to be an interchange in Colorado. This was one of the first interchanges in the U.S. to have roundabouts at it, but it illustrates a nice concept of wide nodes, narrow roads, where at the ramp terminal intersections, those areas are maybe a little bigger than what they would be, particularly the one on the bottom of the screen, than if they were signalized. But if you look at that bridge, there's only a 2-lane cross section underneath that bridge, one lane each direction on the arterial. And if these were large signalized intersections, there would need to be left turn lanes with storage. That bridge would have had to be completely rebuilt. And that's really what drove this project back in the 90s. There were ski resorts being built nearby. This is I-70 west of Denver. Volumes were growing. The ramp terminal intersections couldn't handle the traffic anymore. And Colorado DOT saved themselves a lot of money by not needing to rebuild those bridges and widening underneath for signalized turn lanes, and instead put in roundabouts. Access management, this is a corridor from Kansas. But you can see here, this is kind of a new edge of town area. All the driveways are directed to the roundabouts at this time, but if any type of mid-block access needs to be put in, it can, perhaps to this area to the left of the screen, you can accommodate right and right access very easily because the roundabouts enable U-turns and make it pretty easy for people to make indirect left turns in and out of driveways. Aesthetics, a lot of roundabouts you'll see have landscaping, ornamental artwork type in the central island, kind of creates a placemaking for a community. Environmental factors, there's some growing evidence that roundabouts have fewer emissions associated with the cars driving through them than sort of your equivalent signalized intersection. And from an operations and maintenance point of view, and this is something that I think is pretty important to public agencies because it's real money that they have to shell out. You don't have to have a signal technician visit a roundabout to replace bulbs, to do routine maintenance in the cabinet. You don't even need to retime your roundabout. So there is kind of on a network level some savings there. A little bit about traffic analysis, kind of a secondary point of this course, but want to at least give you an understanding of what happens at a roundabout. If you look at the picture in the lower right, there's a silver car, and it's determining what that driver is determining, can they enter the roundabout or not. They've yielded there, and what they're really waiting for is a big enough gap between the blue van and the next vehicle coming around, that old VW Bug. And that will, when that gap is big enough, that driver will feel safe entering. What drivers accept on average really becomes the basis of roundabout capacity. And the models in the U.S. have measured this in the field, and when the time gets to be about 4 or 5 seconds between those vehicles, that's typically when drivers feel like it's safe to enter. Kind of a secondary effect on capacity is if there were more cars in line behind the silver car, how long would it take them to move up to that yield line and start making that same decision? What does this look like in the highway capacity manual world? It kind of comes down to the flow rates of vehicles, because the more vehicles you have, the fewer gaps there are for an entering vehicle to accept. Put it back to Alec now, and he'll talk about design of roundabout.
Thanks, Pete. Roundabout design is based on principles. These principles, which are intended to provide flexibility in design, are not restrictive, but they do help guide the development of the design of the roundabout. We'll go through each of these principles below over the next few slides. But I should point out that these principles often need to be balanced with each other. For instance, while we want speed control at a roundabout, we also need to be able to accommodate the expected design vehicle. Typically, the more speed control that is provided, the harder it becomes to get large vehicles through the roundabout. This is where other concepts, such as approach alignment, come into play. When all is said and done, a roundabout should meet all the design principles listed below. If this can't be done, you may need to consider other traffic control options. In some cases, these other options may be more appropriate than trying to force a roundabout into a location where it is not appropriate. The first task to designing a roundabout is determining the appropriate number of lanes. This is why the operations analysis that Pete talked about is so important. When identifying the lane configuration of your roundabout, you should consider both the current and future traffic volumes. Because fewer lanes have fewer conflict points and generally fewer crashes, it can be advantageous to open a roundabout with fewer lanes than are ultimately needed. In this case, you would want to design your roundabout for the ultimate lane configuration, but open the roundabout with fewer lanes. If the traffic then grows as expected at the intersection, the roundabout can be designed to be expanded to the inside. This allows the ultimate right-of-way to be acquired and the outside footprint of the intersection to be in place. Speed control is the primary reason why roundabouts have the safety performance that Pete talked about. All roundabout entries must have appropriate speed control. During our class, we'll talk about strategies for providing speed control, and we'll walk through some interactive examples about how to properly check speed control at your roundabout designs. The ability to accommodate different sized vehicles needs to be balanced with the speed control principle. While speed control needs to be provided, providing too much speed control can negatively affect the roundabout's ability to accommodate large trucks. Oftentimes, roundabout designs will be an iterative process, with the designer checking both speeds and design vehicle checks as the design is developed. Pedestrian and bicycles also need to be accommodated at roundabouts. Fortunately, pedestrians and bicycle facilities can be installed without sacrificing our ability to provide speed control or accommodate large vehicles. In general, we always want to discourage the use of the central island, set pedestrian crossings back from the yield line, and make sure we're providing appropriate facilities per ADA requirements and for visually impaired pedestrians. We also want to provide options for cyclists to navigate through the roundabout as well. Depending on the skill level and comfort of the cyclist, we'd like to provide options for how bicyclists are handled at roundabouts. Geometric concepts typical at other intersections are also typical at roundabouts. We want to provide smooth approaches, and at multi-lane roundabouts, we want to align entering vehicles into the appropriate circulating lane. During our class, we'll spend quite a bit of time discussing multi-lane roundabouts, which can be much more complicated to design than single-lane roundabouts. Lastly, like at all intersections, sight distance needs to be provided at roundabouts. However, unlike other intersections, you don't want to provide much more than the minimum sight distance at roundabouts. Limiting sight distance, especially over the central island, helps to keep vehicle speeds low at a roundabout. We hope you've enjoyed listening to our webinar. This slide provides a quick summary of what we hope you're able to learn from this webinar today. First, roundabouts are engineered traffic circles that have three basic characteristics. They are circular, yield on entry, and have geometric features to control speeds. In the appropriate context, roundabouts work well because they are able to reduce certain collision types and slow speeds, which helps reduce the severity of crashes if a crash does occur. Further, at certain volume thresholds, roundabouts are able to provide improved traffic operations as well. When designing roundabouts, it's important to consider design principles. Well-designed roundabouts will have the appropriate number of entering, circulating, and exit lanes, speed control, and be able to accommodate pedestrians, bicycles, and your design vehicle. Thank you for listening to our webinar. Pete and I look forward to seeing you at our class in October. Thanks.